My name is Neha Scher-Shah. And I'm so glad you guys are here From Insights to Impact, Integrating Research into Design. This event is brought to you by the IxDF Las Vegas Chapter. I'm the chapter leader, and we're here to have an open, collaborative discussion about how research fits into the design process. What's working, what's not, and what could be done better, or what is being done now and what could be done better. And so we'll have a great discussion today. And some of the, I wanted to touch base on the housekeeping and how to participate in this session. So we're recording the session. So if you need to step away, you can always catch up later, but we'll have an official Q&A at the end. But you're welcome to post questions at any time. If we can, we'll address them during the discussion. To help us track questions, please type them in the chat using like a format like question for the speaker name and then your question. So that'll allow me to address your question to the specific speaker. And please keep your microphones muted unless speaking during the question and answers. And before we begin, let's get to know each other. Please type in the chat where you're joining from. That would help us to see what our community outreach is and who all are joining from all of the different places. And while you do that, I will introduce our speakers today. I'm incredibly lucky to have an amazing panel of speakers with us. A huge thank you to our speakers for generously sharing their time and experience. We have Chris Eisbach. Did I say that correctly?
That's right, yep.
A user experience design principal at IBM. Chris has over 20 years of experience transforming complex enterprise systems into intuitive experiences. He also founded the AI Design Guild, setting ethical AI standards and improving IBM's developer experience. That is huge and very relevant in today's time. Welcome, Chris. And then we have Belinda Jones, a user experience design leader. Belinda specializes in mixed methods research and service design. She has led digital transformation projects, research advocacy, and cross-functional collaboration across private and public sectors, including Capital One and academia. Welcome, Belinda. You're my kind of girl into research. And then we have Sam Turley, a fellow chapter leader and a lead experience researcher at Precision Dialogue. Sam has a decade of qualitative research experience across industries like finance, healthcare, retail, and insurance. She also volunteers for NASA, wow, doing science outreach. And cherry on top, Rita de Almeida, a UX research manager at Everway. Rita works on K-12 curriculum and assistive technology. And she has held research roles at Comcast, NBC Universal, Macmillan Learning, and Amazon, and also runs Sputnik and Fizzle, a small press of poetry books. So precious. And again, a huge thank you to all of you for sharing and being here today. And so with that, let's dive in. Chris, I'm going to pick on you. My first question is to you. In your experience, where does research tend to fit into design process? Does it feel like an essential part of the workflow, or is it more of a nice to have?
Well, I think that research should be an essential part of any program that we're doing. Any kind of design should have research as part of it. Practicality says that doesn't always happen. Research can be part of any part of the whole process. You can do the pre set of stuff before you get started to make sure you're doing the right stuff. You can do it as you go to validate that what you're doing is right, or you could do a follow-up usability review to make sure that what you did was okay so you know what to do the next time. So, and I've been on projects that have every part of the gambit from almost zero, which we fight for that not to happen, to the full gamut, where we actually do a full set of usability reviews to understand, to make sure we're solving the right problems in the very beginning. So it's really about how can you fit it into the budget and the time you have to make sure that you actually get validation.
Yeah. So what does good integration really would look like? Like, what is the Is there an example, maybe Belinda, you can chime in, where research truly shaped the design outcome in your experience?
Yes, thank you. Let's see, research integration. I would say like the first thing that comes to mind for me is just those relationships with our stakeholders, so product, tech, and kind of thinking back to my previous experiences, research that has really made a profound impact have definitely been just the stakeholders, as I mentioned before, just the teams that we're going into. So a good example would be when I was part of an API team, but platform, like an API platform. And we had like tech teams coming in to onboard their API. I was the very first designer who joined that particular team. So it was 2 product owners. And the first thing was definitely being able to understand what that problem space is. It was very technical. So also being able to understand, where is the business coming in from, any user insights. And again, it was mostly internal. So it's all these tech teams coming in. And what I did was just kind of learning from the product owners was I jumped in, did a journey map and a service blueprint. And at that point, it was, in a sense, just this artifact that was able to create this collaboration all across. So I was pulled in to present to like a features workshop specific to engineers. And it was interesting because just kind of going through that specific service blueprint, it was easy for them to then say, okay, that specific part of that will end to end. We're going to pull out and own it from an engineering standpoint, or we'll own it and maybe have to hire like an engagement specialist. So yeah, so just really good collaboration and being able to pull all those insights from research.
So Rita, in your experience, like how do you think the projects go if you have research done and have a service blueprint like Belinda shared versus not? Have you had experiences with that?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't catch it first time.
So in your experience, if you've had research done where you have some preliminary research done and the researchers have gathered a lot of insights and have created a service blueprint or created journey mapping versus not, like how does it go in both instances?
Okay, in terms of impact. Honestly, I think it's something that depends on leadership. If leadership is invested in research, they'll ask for it. They'll ask for those blueprints. They'll use them. If leadership is open to being contradicted, they'll ask for it and they'll use it. If not, sometimes they ask for it, but it becomes an artifact that it's not used. I also think it's part of our role to help people use it. So not just bring the research, but say, hey, let's work together and figure out how we can apply this to your role. Or even just say, here's the findings. Here's what happens if there's no action. What are the results in action? Let's avoid those. How can we avoid those? So I think it's a mix of having leadership buy-in and their own interest, or if you're like fighting against the folks coming in, and making sure those insights are productive and actionable and help them out. I think it's like those things that need to work out.
Yeah, I really think that giving the risks to leadership of what you risk not doing the research is important, so that they make a decision and they're consciously deciding to not worry about those risks, because when they go wrong, then they can only learn from that.
Yeah.
So what have you done to get stakeholder buy-in? Feel free to jump in. So I'm sure it's different for different companies. So what are the tactics, strategies? What have you done?
Absolutely. So I want to start off by saying, I don't know if if there's folks on this call who are listening and maybe trying to get started or newer to this industry, but I love this question because I think stakeholder buy-in is one of the most important skills that you can have in this industry. And it's also one that I see younger, newer folks struggle with the most. So stakeholder buy-in, it's not something that's necessarily directly taught, but it's a vital skill to develop. And for me, one of the biggest things is you almost have to think of it as you're somebody who has to speak multiple types of language in terms of every subunit of an organization has their own jargon and language. And it doesn't mean you have to learn the intricacies of it, but you have to be familiar and understanding of that. You also have to reflect on what are you saying on a day-to-day basis that is jargon, that is something that would make perfect sense to a room of UX designers and researchers, but would make zero sense to somebody who you pulled off the street. You're never going to know what the knowledge background is of every one of your audiences. Unfortunately, you're not going to have that, background sheet, as nice as that would be to have. So I think a key skill for that is practicing selling your work in different ways. You should, for anything that you're doing, I think having a 5-second, 10-second elevator pitch of this got better because we did X then Y, and having it in very simple language that, again, you could pull anybody off the street and have them understand is key. Being able to understand what different stakeholder priorities are is key. And you, again, won't know the nuance, but you need to be able to at least come from a place of empathy to where they're looking at it. They might be looking at it from the financial impact, the timing impact, the project load impact, the end user impact. One person might be sitting there and their only concern is how are they going to turn this entire conversation into a one-page brief for the CEO. There's a bunch of different hats that people are wearing in any presentation or update or even email that you're providing, any type of communication. So remembering that, trying to consider what they might have as their top priority, and knowing that it's every bit as important to them as your design and research work is to yourself is, to me, I think that the biggest thing with stakeholders and getting them to buy in is just starting with a place of empathy.
That's a great point.
100%.
Ali had a question. How do you track, document, present risks in a way that speaks to leadership?
I think it's know your audience, and everyone is different. So you may have a leader who really wants the details and was like, what data do you have to prove this? Or you have another leader who actually likes to visualize what kind of data it is. So if you know your audience, you can also present it in a way that they can ingest better. And then once you have that, it's make sure everything is based on actual data and on their needs. I think part of having that, like, that negotiation of knowing exactly that was mentioned right now, every single thing, it's also then reflects on the types of deliverables that you use to make that argument.
That's
that
a great
what I was going to say. That gets back to what Sam was saying, that allowing yourself to be the universal translator, translate engineering to business to end user is really important job of the designer. And so you should know, how do you relate your findings to what the stakeholders find valuable? What are they actually seeking out? And because sometimes there might be all kinds of errors and they don't care because that's not what they're trying to do. You might want them to care, but it might not be what their goal is. So you should be aware of that. And one of the key things you need to do that is to kind of build trust, show that you can provide them value. And once you do that, then they can listen to you, that you can help them provide end user value. So it kind of helps make the whole thing go around.
The question that I try to ask myself whenever I'm getting ready to present any type of deliverable or even just update is, how is this going to affect this specific audience, not my end user audience, but my stakeholder audience? How is this going to affect them? And how could it make their work easier? And with that, sometimes, how could it make their work harder? Because even if you just acknowledge, look, I know if you're talking to your engineering team, look, I know this kind of sucks. This is going to be some extra work, but you're only going to have to do it once. And if we hadn't done this research, you might be doing it 3 or 4 times, trying to, again, at least acknowledge that they have their own 100% capacity that's usually full to the brim, and again being empathetic with that. And then Rita, you made a great point earlier about if it's kind of a dream sometimes, but if you can tailor deliverables to different audiences, if you can create different types of deliverables of the same, in my case, of the same research, that can go miles, because one person might benefit from a one pager, somebody else might want to take in the whole shebang, that whole big beefy report that you thought you were going to be the only person who ever read. So keeping that in mind too. Don't give an essay to somebody who only has time for a paragraph.
Yeah.
Then just to add, the other thing also is remembering that stakeholders can also be part of the research. So bring them into
100%.
research sessions, bring them into synthesizing sessions, so that they pretty much understand a lot of the problem space, the pain points, needs. And I think that will kind of help with being able to distill some of this information.
Nothing could be
Love
more
that.
enlightening than bringing an executive sponsor to observe but not say a word, and a usability test for something that they're trying to make happen. And when they watch users struggle and say, well, how do they not know there's a button right there to press me? It's like, no, because that's how users are. You know, you can wish them to know things, but they just don't. And you need to recognize that. You can't change the end users. You have to make sure that the system meets them where they're at.
And I think that addresses a great point that somebody brought up in the chat, which is tactics to use to facilitate smooth stakeholder relationships. Letting them know that you're not just working behind a curtain and you'll bring the curtain down when everything's done is huge. If you let them see the process, ask questions as the process goes, the more that they get to see and learn and experience in the work of the project, the fewer questions they're usually going to have at the end, because they're going to know the whys behind it.
Exactly.
And you also probably, go ahead, sorry.
Transparency is really important from the beginning when you're doing the research plan, but even when you're doing discussions guides, assuming it's moderated study, right? Having the recordings available for them. So when you're having the discussion, even if they just like saw ×2 one of the interviews, it's not really new. Like they've already start consuming some of the information. And if you keep that transparency, you also make them feel like they're a part of the process. They have a stake in it as well. So that helps with buy-in.
Put the stake in stakeholder.
Yep.
And hopefully your stakeholders want good outcomes. And that's frankly what we're always after. The outcome is what matters. It doesn't matter what process you took, didn't matter how long it took. What matters is, do you have an outcome that's better than the previous one? And hopefully you can make the stakeholders look good by having better outcomes in the end. And so you can show them that you're not just trying to add a bunch of extra steps to something that they think they can get done faster, but you're actually helping them get something better in the end. And it can actually be faster ultimately by going through the process.
I work in an agency. I was just going to quickly say I work in an agency model, and we don't ever really spell this out for clients, but we absolutely have it in our mind that part of our job is to make our clients look good to their users, look good to their bosses, look good, compared to their competitors. So that's a perfectly valid thing to be thinking about, is the impact it's having on stakeholders and their own goals, because we all have our own personal motivations. None of us I don't think any of us would do this, all the time for free. Like we do this because it's our jobs as well and we like it, but we still have that motivation to do it because we want to succeed in their career and get paid for it. Other stakeholders have that same goal. So that's perfectly valid to think about. And back to you. Sorry about that.
Well, I love and agree with everything that you guys are saying. I think what I personally, as a researcher, what I struggle with is, what are those steps that I can go to my stakeholders and say, this is what I want to do as a researcher at the beginning of the project, or before the project really gets handed off to the design team. Or I know I have fellow colleagues who are designers here, who what can they ask the researcher to do? Like, what can they come to me and say, hey, Neha, I have a design project and doesn't look like there's any research being done, but like, what are those things that are that we can do together as a proof of concept that we can show and say, okay, we did this research and look, this has yielded really good results in the design process. What are those things? Kind of want to dive into that.
I'll jump in. So just kind of thinking back through all my different roles, it's never been perfect, right? So it's not that we're all coming in at the same time and we're creating this roadmap. We know what the product is. We know what the outcomes are going to be. Most of the time, design has been engaged or joined maybe at the very end, and there's already a proof of concept. Product and tech pretty much kind of know what they want. So we're coming in and knowing, okay, so we need to test it out. What are users saying about the product? What are the other features that are in the backlog that are going to be rolled out? And can we prioritize it? Maybe bring in or work with product to be able to prioritize that backlog. So in regards to steps, it's tough. Like I've never had them come to me and say, hey, design, we want you to research this. It's always been, hey, you know what, let design test, because then, research is also quite a bit of work to do and time consuming.
Yeah.
I think it's part of our job also to help people translate and figure out exactly what research is needed. So stakeholders can come to you and they have questions, and you're listening to their questions as if they're coming to you with research questions. And then what you need to do is translate what are actually their goals into like specific goals they'll use at research, because they might not be the same. And one of the things that I sometimes do is when I see there's disagreement between stakeholders, I ask them actually the best way is to do this async and just ask them to fill it out, a list of all their assumptions. And then below all the assumptions as well, like what is this assumption what is the problem you're trying to solve, who you're trying to solve it with, how you think you're trying to solve it, and put all those assumptions. Then create their own goals that will address those assumptions. And then that is actually also a really good way at the end to present your findings, is you literally go like assumption, true, false, unproven, the results, the why, like why is this true or false, besides all your goals. So you help them translate their needs into actual research goals by listening to them, by making sure those questions, that those assumptions are all addressed. And then from then on, they usually then trust you to come to you and say, hey, I have doubts around here. And then you go like, well, I think the best approach would be X, Y, and Z. That's how I've seen it work best.
I
It's
love that
interesting
approach.
how
And
I was just going to say, interesting how often some people don't even realize that they're making any assumptions. And it's really good to get them thinking about that, because everyone does about everything. And it's important for people to realize that they might not actually know what they think they know. They kind of assume it. And it's always great to have some sort of test on it to make sure that it's valid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and reminding them that assumptions aren't a bad thing. They are a key part of how we operate as humans.
Sure.
Is important. We're not judging you for having assumptions. I'm always that's something that I do that I think in the past research purity would kind of say, oh, well, don't not acknowledge this. But I found a lot of success in acknowledging, coming into the room and say, hey, I'm the researcher. Here's a few things that I'm kind of making some assumptions about. So I'm going to write these down so I'm aware of it as we go through this process. And I'd love to hear what your all's assumptions are too. That can be a really great communication tool, especially when it's used early.
And also because then you can see if you're targeting the right problem, because it can come to you and say like, hey, we need to figure out if the solution is right. And then through their assumptions, you figure out actually you need to understand if the problem space is the right one, not if this is the right solution, because you can't get there yet. So that's also something that I think makes research better, but also creates those relationships that then you need to get the buy-in.
Yeah, people want to start with a solution. But the whole purpose of research and design is to work towards and then iterate on the solution. But you can't just start with it, or you're going to be spending more time reworking it than you would have if you had just started from a place of investigation instead of jumping straight into the solutioning.
Yeah. So what about speeds. Like sometimes it seems like the design process goes at a different speed than the research process. So how do you reconcile that?
I find if you have the resources, it's always good to have a dedicated research team that can actually do that while you're doing design and while it's being implemented, so that you have continuous feedback, continuous iterations. You could be usability testing the previous version. You could be testing prototypes with a small set of users. You can be doing things of that nature in order to just get feedback as you go. That's not always practical. So the question is, how do you interweave some research duties while you're designing, while you're reviewing what's being coded and all that kind of stuff? So a lot of times you don't have the time to just dedicate to pure research, especially while you're in the middle of something. Maybe you can do it, sprint zero, when people are just starting to think about it, and maybe you can do it after it's kind of been released. But these days, what does that even mean? Because we have continuous releases, we have continuous development integration. So you kind of have to also have continuous research and kind of build it in there, so it's you're continuously getting feedback.
That's true. Belinda?
That means sometimes it's a small number of people.
Yeah.
I think it's a negotiation, right? Because when you're building up roadmaps, you need to think of like, okay, we need this research that is more strategic. It's going to take longer, but it's going to yield you X, Y, and Z. And at the same time, you need to tackle more tactical things that they just need. So maybe you have two lanes. You have one lane that is doing this longer term project. During that longer term project, you make sure you share insights periodically, so they they don't have to wait X amount of months to get insights. And then you have another lane where you have rolling research. You have set days where you just sit down, listen to customers for like within a sprint, and ask those like tiny questions that are like super useful for a designer right then, but wouldn't actually justify a full-on study. So if you have several lanes and you juggle your roadmap, and then you just prioritize. You're just like, I have X amount of researchers, this is what I can do. Do you want something else? What do we take out? So I think it's always negotiation.
Yeah, just to add, and Chris, yes, totally agree. If we had more designers, we would kind of split all the work into be awesome. But in most cases, designers are spread pretty thin, and I think researchers as well. So being a service designer, kind of doing my own research, I've spaced it out whereby, kind of making sure that the research is done before the design, or working on different projects, but just kind of spacing it out. And then I think to the point of just being able to kind of work with product partner. I think Sam, that you responded in the chat, is just being able to understand, what keeps them up at night in regards to the product owners. And then being able to understand what exactly are they trying to achieve by end of year or end of quarter. And I think from a design and even research standpoint, and from a product standpoint, we're all going towards the same goal. We just have different ways to get there. So I think the more we communicate, the more we build those relationships, it'll be amazing how, just those collaborations can be there.
And just for reference, Yana asked, what about the negative attitude of a PM who thinks that user research is useless in a complex domain and doesn't understand why we need to talk to users? I understand that it's important to show how it can reduce work, but what if we don't have anything yet, so we can't measure the time saved and can only see the final result? It's a great question.
Hold in there. Like, I've been in that situation. Just hold on, do the first study, just like get through it, because once they see the results, then you start getting it. It's hard. I know it's really hard, but just like hang in there, go through the first study, bringing that value, show them something actionable, show them that you actually are helping them solve a problem, and then they'll be the ones nagging you and asking, oh, please, can you run this research? So just hold on there.
And you don't need anything specific to, I mean, the question kind of implies that you need something tangible to test. In the very beginning, you can talk to end users with do you do this task? What are the most important things? What information do you have when you come to this task? What do you need to complete it? And these kinds of things so that you can better understand what resources should I have in my interface so that people can accomplish their tasks. Too many times someone has a form and all of a sudden there's a question. It's like, where does that come from? What does that even mean? And you want to make sure that you actually use their domain language if it's specific for a particular role, or give them access to references that they can actually answer the questions. Otherwise, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah. Generative research is so undervalued still compared to evaluative research. So one of my favorite circumstances, and somebody comes to us and says, hey, we're trying to solve this problem, but we want to understand more about the problem first. And then you let me go and actually talk to the people who are having this problem, who would benefit from a solution. They're going, the light bulb moments that happen when stakeholders get into that room are some of the most fun things you can be a part of in this industry, because it gets them thinking outside of the boxes that they have been working within. So yeah, that discovery research, I'm a huge fan of in-depth interviews. I think there's nothing better than going and talking to people, especially as we saw the business world shift so heavily into seeing the value of big data, but maybe over prioritizing it sometimes and thinking that it doesn't need a contextualization of qualitative research is something that we see a lot. Yeah, talking to people is great, but the other tools, prioritization, using, card sorting and tree testing, things like that can be great for earlier research as well. So try to break stakeholders away from the mindset of research is something you do once the design is done, and think of it as research as something that you can do before the design is even started. And it's something that can hold the hand of a design process throughout. And you'll see really cool results.
And to that end, it's surprising how often you hear users complaining about some particular step that isn't working and they need to fix that. But you find out when you actually look into it that the real problem is 2 steps earlier, when they're forced to make a choice that doesn't make any sense and they end up in a dead end. So if you're just solving the problem that users think they have without actually looking into why they're getting into that problem, sometimes you're solving a problem that didn't even actually exist at that point. You're actually band-aiding something when you should fix it earlier, and the whole thing becomes more smooth.
Yeah, that's a huge thing to emphasize with stakeholders too, is users are experts of their own experiences. They're not experts of usability. And it's the research and designer's job to translate what that feedback is into what the actual problem is. Because if you cut us out of the process, then you can have a project manager saying, oh, well, she clicked X instead of Y, so we need to make X bigger. But like Chris said, it could be that the problem was that's on page 7 and the problem was back on page 1, or maybe even before they got to the page in the first place. So
Right.
that's a great mindset to adopt for sure.
And so how do you see, do you feel that in order to chart or map the user's experience, it's almost like service design becomes, or the blueprinting becomes like almost second nature to a researcher? Because as a researcher, I find myself looking through the entire journey. What email did they get? What did they click that brought them to where that was broken? Like kind of that kind of stuff. Do you see that it's not too far from being able to understand the whole gamut of their experience? So Linda?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
So you have had experience with service design, right? So do you find that research and service design kind of go together? Because in order to understand the user's entire process of what they're experiencing, it's important to see not just the UX part, but also other places where they're coming in from.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I do think that service design blueprints or just service design is research in itself. It's very strategic. Yeah, and yes, and it's interesting because then once we map out, the whole end to end, you're looking at the different stakeholders, the different tools that are being used. You're seeing a lot of inefficiencies or opportunity areas to be able to solve. So yes, I definitely agree.
Absolutely. I think it's easy to get the field of UX is a great example of every few years there's a new term that comes out that becomes the new buzzword. And I think we've all probably heard 9 or 10 different terms used to refer to what we do. And we're all sitting thinking, I'm still doing the same things, y'all. It's just a different label to put on it. So when you you think about UX and you think about interaction designs, this is an interaction design event, but service design is key to understanding. Customer experience is the big buzzword of recency, at least, and that's what my label is. But I mention all that to say it does point to an evolution of UX being beyond digital interfaces and more about thinking holistically about the entire experience. So if you can wear that hat, you're much more future proofed than somebody who has a lot of confidence in Figma and little confidence anywhere else. Yeah, like yeah, that great point. It was human factors engineer, usability engineer. We were all engineers back in the 60s, and then things changed. But yeah, think about the holistic experience that they're having, because very rarely is it starting and ending on your website.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it comes to, I also think of all of it as UX research. I don't see a difference. But for instance, we just finished end-to-end experience of a teacher completing a certain task. It is product agnostic. It starts when the teacher gets into school or actually before the teacher gets in school, because they're already working at home. And then they get to school and then they work on paper. They talk to this person to talk that person. They're teaching, they have 5 minutes to go and sit and work on your platform, and then they leave. And all of that is part of your user experience. It's not those 15 minutes that they have on your platform that you're using. So if you don't have that context, you can't understand behaviors. So yeah.
And I was just going to add, part of service design is also non-digital. So it's looking at those services that also need to be improved or, are doing pretty well. Almost like we call it the non-tangibles. And a good example would be in regards to processes, like internal processes. Like, I think we can all agree that some of the internal tools that we use and systems are quite legacy. So just being able to revamp them, could be one of those.
That's great. I'm looking at some questions here. Have you noticed this is, I'm gonna not be able to say your name correctly. Kianyu? Have you noticed in your experience research processes and timelines being compressed, and there's a demand for rapid research?
For sure. I mean, that's sort of that's kind of really started with the advent of Agile and trying to get things faster and trying to get things out there. And that's when you might need to do, lean usability studies, fewer people, but at least get some checked back. But yeah, that definitely has happened. So it becomes a challenge, and we've had to try to get buy-in for the idea that research might span sprints. When someone is mandating everything must be done in this sprint, otherwise you're in violation of Agile Law 1375. It's like, if you're feeling that way, you're kind of missing the whole point of Agile. But okay. So.
Yeah.
And there's some workarounds, like even if you have a longer project, maybe the way you organize your project, you have like either interim reports or interim work sessions where you already start sharing insights and already get stakeholders involved. That helps as well. So there are like some workarounds that you can do.
And then there was another question from Val. Do you recruit people for a team for the entirety of your design projects, or do you bring people in at different times in the process?
As in
I'd answered that in the chat, and I just said in my team we try to assign someone from the beginning and stay with it, unless it becomes really long and then you might swap people out. I'm sure it's different at other places.
Yeah, we try to do that. Again, we're a little different because we're an agency, so we're working with folks, but we do have in-house design as well as a robust research team. But I think you see a lot of benefits from having folks stick with projects for the long haul. That being said, there is also, this is kind of a side tangent of that, don't underestimate the value of fresh eyes if you can have them. If you're struggling with something, find somebody who has no idea what the heck you're talking about, but maybe works in your domain. So find that researcher who's like, wait, what project? And then say, all right, it's this project, I'm struggling with this. Because it's so easy to be, because you're when you're working on projects, you're trying to become an expert in it. So you're becoming an expert in a lot of things in this field, which is one of the fun parts about it, but it's also one of the challenging parts because it can be very cognitively overwhelming. So bring somebody in with fresh eyes. That's really, as an agency, one of our biggest roles, to be fresh eyes to problems. But yeah, leave space if you can for that approach, and it can frequently shed light on things you weren't considering. So it's a benefit more than a have to have, but definitely keep it in mind when you can. Speaking from some very recent experience there.
Seems fresh. Well, I kind of want to turn to the audience, and I want to ask if they can write in chat some of the challenges that they faced in connecting research and design, or kind of meeting the two together in a way that's beneficial. And I'd love to know what you all have experienced. But yes, this topic of AI keeps coming up, and since Chris, you've worked with AI so much, and I'm sure other of the speakers have worked as well, so please feel free to share. But what is the ethics of AI in research and design, especially for research? Because how much should I let AI know about what's broken in my company? How much is it okay to get assistance?
When it comes to AI, there you can be just aware of how to use certain models and that kind of stuff. Not all AI is absorbing every comment you make, especially if you host it yourself. The problem is you don't want to let AI replace real research, because if you ask the AI a question that you would normally ask a human just because it's faster, and I've seen people talking about that, where oh, this make this pretend to be humans, and then we're going to put them in the system and see what happens. I don't know how valid that is. Maybe it's a little valid in some places. It'll probably find big problems, so it'll probably. I'm just not convinced it's going to find you the subtle things that real humans would find.
Mm-hmm. That's a big challenge, though, isn't it, Chris? Because we're obviously not convinced, and I feel very confident in not being convinced with that. But when you have folks who don't know the intricacies of what we do and how we do it, you know, I don't want to like paint a broad brush, but I think about somebody who comes from the MBI mindset of, you know, how do I maximize value and profit for the company, and that's their priority. How do we convince them that we're better enough than AI to keep us around? I think is really one of the big questions.
Well, anyone who thinks they can just simply replace people with AI are going to be bit in the butt pretty soon. You know, they're going to get rid of people and all of a sudden hit it. And the thing is, it's going to work pretty well for a short period of time because you have momentum. It's going to keep on that momentum. It just won't be able to adjust when something actually comes up that you need intelligence that isn't just statistical answers from what has happened in the past. And then they'll crash into a wall. So
yeah,
we'll be there when the crash happens.
To pick up the pieces.
We'll just be holding the sign that says, we told you so.
The AI can do great things. It can really help with certain things. It can help brainstorm. It can help get through, come up with lots of options.
Yeah.
For someone who actually has experience to assess, oh, these three are good, and go forward with it. That kind of thing is great. But relying on it to replace whole humans is, I'm fully convinced, and at IBM we're pretty on board with the idea that AI is good at augmenting humans.
Yes.
AI is good at some things. Humans are good at some things. When you bring them together, they're better at more things. But they're not humans.
I see it as very analogous in a lot of ways to when big data became such a trend with companies. It's extremely powerful. You should know how to use it. You should know what's happening with it. There are going to be a lot of people who think it can just replace what people do. But like Chris said, they're probably going to be sorely surprised, or at least they should be at some point, that it's a great augmentation to what humans can do, but it doesn't replace it. I think you said it extremely well with that.
And I think the problem is it's going to work pretty well for a short period of time. So they're probably going to be happy with themselves. Mm-hmm. And then it's going to probably go terribly wrong. So
it's a useful tool when we're using. Someone talked about the ethics. I think also that has to do with what data you share, if you anonymize it, if you're doing in a platform like Notebook LM, which is not putting any of that data out. But for instance, I find it super useful, like you did 17 interviews, 30-page transcripts, and you need, like, you vaguely remember where it was, and but you don't, and you can just ask it to, hey, find me quotes that match this or that answer this insight, and it just pulls you the transcript where it is. You remember what it is. Now I have the Zoom timestamp. I can go and edit my film so much quicker to do that highlight reel that it's going to bring it in. So like those are types of things that have saved me hours and hours of sifting through. But it's also because you ran the interview, so you have the entire thing in your mind and you recognize, and you just like, oh, this is the time where they were showing me their notebook.
Wow. Notebook LM, you said?
Notebook LM, it's from Google.
Yeah, Google's
Oh,
thing. And the new one, which is what, Deep Research or no,
Deep Research,
AI
yeah.
Studio. AI Studio does that and more now, where it can go out and do research. I mean, they're great tools. You can do really good things with those.
Not substitute.
But like
No.
you said, they find patterns and things that you can then make use of. You know, it is good at transcribing. It's good at generating certain ideas, that kind of stuff. So there's definitely value that can save hours of time. It's just not a replacement for a person, I don't think, yet.
Yeah. I was going to add, so when we think of regulated industries, right? So example would be fintech. I think from a design and research standpoint, like what we're even saying about just being able to, you know, speed up the processes, prototyping, synthesizing, it sounds so amazing. But I think being in these kinds of industries, we're somewhat limited. And we always look to improve the manualness of processes and do away with some of these things. But then when we kind of turn and look at our processes, they're still quite very manual because, you know, we still have to, you know, conduct all those interviews, we have to recruit, we have to synthesize. And I think what I can remember is, I think the only AI automation was through the transcribing, but everything is still quite very manual. Now, for those who are in non-regulated industries, you know, I mean, it's just like a plethora of different tools that we can use. So just kind of being able to kind of think through those different industries.
Yeah, I'm in a regulated industry as well, so I understand. I'm very relevant to my situation right now. Oh my God, it's like the time has flown by. We have maybe 10 minutes left. I can't believe it. It's such a good conversation. If there's anyone that wants to talk to the speakers directly, please raise your hand and I'll put you through. If not, that's okay. I think we took all of the questions. I'm not sure if there's any left. But if there are, post your questions and let me know if you have any desire speaking to the speakers. But since we have only a little bit of time left, I kind of want to pivot to, we did a little bit, we started talking about tools. Are there any other tools that have been really, not just AI, but other things for research and design where you could really use that tool to integrate both parties together? What are some of the tools you've used in the past that help with that interaction and integration? I know we use Figma, and I've transferred a lot of my readouts into Figma so that I can make those insights available. So what is something else that we do on a regular basis?
I was going to say Figma myself, because you have the design, you have the prototype, you can have data right there. You can give access to all your developers so they can see things as you go. You don't have the problem with them developing to an old design because it's always up to date. All those kinds of things are great. So that's been very helpful to get teams on the same, because I've dealt worked on some very large projects where we had 12 designers all trying to work together in squads that don't necessarily talk to each other all the time. And so we need the end result to feel like one product. And so that really helps where everyone can be in the same space and see each other's work and then try to solve design problems in the same way. So they're more likely to develop something that feels like it's designed by one person as opposed to the 12 independent people that did it.
Yeah. We have a question from, I think that's Vivian. Hi, Vivian. For all panelists, how do you feel about the idea of using AI? We're back to AI to moderate interview sessions. You talked about using AI to improve productivity. What about using it to moderate interviews itself? I think, Sam, you were just talking about that.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to what I said earlier in the chat of that will replace bad researchers. If you can't show that you're any better than a robot than talking as at talking to somebody, ironic to stumble there, I know, but if you can't prove that there's more value in you as a human than at least the current state of AI, maybe it takes leaps forward. Who knows? But then, yeah, that is going to replace it, and there are going to be people who say, I don't really care about good, I care about cheap, and this is cheaper than hiring humans. But there are many reasons that robots are not people. But the big thing for me is empathy. So much about having conversations with people comes down to the empathy element. And to the best of my knowledge, unless I've missed some headlines somewhere, AI can't express true empathy right now. And when you're talking about even seemingly innocuous things like window purchases or grocery store shopping, it becomes very emotional for people in surprising ways because you are at the end of the day talking about their lives and people care about their lives. And if you don't have an AI that can reflect and empathize and contextualize what you're hearing from people, you are missing out on the heart of what research can and should do for an organization.
Now it's interesting. There's already standalone usability testing things that people can do where they can log into a website and it walks them through things. And it's very rote, very systematic and that kind of stuff. And it's kind of better than nothing kind of research. And I can see where adding some AI to that kind of thing could make that slightly better. I think one thing to think about AI in a lot of these situations, most things that it does slightly better than average. So if you're an average performer on something, it might do slightly better than you. But the truth is, people who are doing something as a career are probably all better than an average person, which I'm not talking about an average designer. I'm talking about an average person. So one would think a designer is better than average at designing than an average person is at designing. And so that's what you're competing against. It might be better than nothing, and it could have its place, but I wouldn't rely on it for everything. And when it comes, interesting thing about empathy, I did see some things where they are actually talking about, they actually had one of the models, I don't know if it's ChatGPT or what, doing interviews with patients, giving information about medical diagnoses and that kind of stuff. And I actually was more empathetic than the doctors were. I don't know if it's more about the AI than the doctors, but that was a surprising result to me.
That's so interesting. I would love, I'm so fascinated. I could talk for hours about this alone, but perception versus reality and how perception essentially is reality. So
Yeah.
I've worked with a lot of medical clients and doctors can be their own breed. So
Sure.
that's fascinating. I remember seeing a little bit about that. But yeah,
there's another thing with like psychologists. If you're going to talk to someone, sometimes people prefer to talk to an AI because they don't feel judged. They feel like they can say more. I don't know what that means. I'm a little worried about that in general. But if it helps them talk through things, then I don't know.
But boy, talking about that, not feeling judged, I think that is a really huge skill to have if you're in a position where you're talking with users, is making sure that you never come across as judgmental of them. And I say that because I've seen a lot of newer folks in this industry struggle with that a little bit, of maybe having trouble hiding a little bit of frustration of like, man, I thought that would be a really easy task to get through when they're struggling with it. So absolutely 100% make sure that you are remembering that the user is the expert of their own experience and that you care about their experience goes a long way and will help you battle the robots when it comes down to fighting them for our jobs. So
yeah, I'm gonna bring on an audience member, Zan. Am I saying your name right?
You're saying you're right. Thank you, Neha. And Zahn here. Thank you all. Great panel so far. I'm specifically focused on building UX experiences for low-income consumers to access financial services. So I've been thinking a lot about hallucinations. And, as we all know, AI's ability to generate content at scale is powerful. But these types of issues, hallucinations, unverifiable sources, or critical errors present some of these huge UX challenges, specifically AI experiences in financial services. So keeping transparency, error recovery in mind, are there any effective strategies you guys are coming across, specifically maybe for usability testing to help users verify some of this AI generated information or recover from mistakes? It was a long-winded question.
Any thoughts?
Trying to think. Could you kind of just rephrase that last part for me, Zahn?
Yeah, like DeepSeek came out and it started showing all the inference reasoning, right? The thinking behind the output. And now I think it's in Gemini, you're able to click into some of the sources. And yeah, so just understanding it. I've read from Jacob Nielsen that UX designers can aid in avoiding the AI to hallucinate. I don't know exactly what that means, but in order to maintain trust, he talked a lot about usability testing to make sure that they're able to complete their tasks completely, so they're not fooled by the AI's hallucination. So it's kind of like mitigating some of that along the way through good UX design. So just wondering if any strategies come to mind.
There's a lot of things you can do to limit the amount of hallucinations. One thing is to actually give references and force the AI to use those references as guidelines. RAG is one of the things, which is resource augmented generation, I think. I'm not resource minded.
Retrieval, yeah.
Retrieval, thank you. And so that kind of thing helps. So it really kind of depends on how you frame those things. There's also techniques where you have it evaluate itself, because AI tends to be much better at recognizing things than generating things. So it generates stuff and then you can have it look at it and go, oh, that's wrong, And so it can actually do a decent job that way. It's not going to satisfy everything. But when you're talking about things like financial advice for low income people, I think one of the key things to do is to make sure that you, one, understand what are the real issues that they have, being low income, making it approachable, helping them understand, what is the stuff that's important to them, that helps them become less low income, these kinds of things. What are the smart choices that you can make? But also, you don't necessarily need generative AI to put in. That you could do the old fashioned stuff that generative could be used to, natural language processing could be used to understand a question better, but then you can provide answers that human wrote, that is actually well thought out, that is depicted and set up in a way that kind of helps describe things better. That's a way to make sure that it's not just making things up out of whole cloth and leading people down the wrong path.
Yeah, I personally don't think that integration of AI and AI being a tool that executes a lot of the tasks quicker is essentially actually quicker. Because if we have to go back and check the work that AI has done, then that kind of adds to the workload that we already have. So using it in a way that helps us and not adds more work to us, I think that would be the key challenge here. And so we have 1 minute left. Then I don't want to take you off the air, but you're good?
Really interesting question.
Yeah, really, really great. So yeah, this was a really great conversation. I honestly, in the beginning of the conversation, I was thinking, oh my God, it's an hour. I hope we have enough things to talk about, but it just flew by. And I feel like I haven't talked to any of you enough about anything. I wish we could do a second round if we can, but yeah, great. Sam, thank you. Thank you, Chris. If Belinda and Rita, if you could also post in your LinkedIn profile so people could reach out and connect with you in the chat, that would be great. And again, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you speakers, so generous with your time and experience and knowledge. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll get
Thanks,
back
everybody.
together
Great
again.
questions.
Yeah, thanks to everybody who came out. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See ya.